Hello and welcome to this discussion on peace and the pandemic, which has been organised by LSE Ideas. My name is Mary Martin. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at LSE Ideas and I'm the Director of the UN Business and Human Security Initiative. Thank you to all of you for joining me today. We span 3 time zones, I think, just with our speakers. So good evening to New Zealand, late good evening. Good morning in Barcelona and also here in the UK, 1 hour behind. I think it's fair to say that it's an unusual time for any of us to participate in public events like this. They're normally held at LSE, as probably many of you know, in the early evening. But we are all becoming obviously very good at adapting to more fluid schedules. And perhaps adaptability is the subtext, could be the subtext for our discussion today. How should we understand threats to peace and stability in the age of COVID-19? And how should we devise new responses to that challenge, and particularly the challenges that are faced by fragile and conflict-affected countries, which these threats may have been altered and magnified by the health emergency. So that's the nub of our discussion. The event is part of the LSE's series on COVID-19, the policy response. It is being recorded and will be available as a podcast on the LSE events webpage. If you want to ask a question, please do so at any time during the discussion. You can do it via the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And please tell us your name and your affiliation, and I'll try and get in as many questions as possible, both throughout the course of the discussion with our speakers, but also obviously there'll be time dedicated for Q&A at the end. And it really helps if you can make your intervention short so we can cover as many comments and questions as possible. If you want to tweet, the hashtag is LSE COVID-19, that's all one word. And we're also streaming live on Facebook and you can ask questions there. So let me get underway by introducing our speakers. First, Helen Clarke is a former New Zealand Prime Minister and a former United Nations Development Programme Administrator. She currently chairs the boards of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative and the Partnership for Maternal, Newborn and Child Health. She's a frequent contributor to discussions on issues related to sustainable development, the Sustainable Development Goals, and women's leadership. Hello, Helen in New Zealand. Mareike Schomerus is recently appointed Vice President of the Busara Centre for Behavioural Economics in Nairobi. Prior to that, she was the Director of Programme Politics and Governance and the Research Director of the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium at the Overseas Development Institute in London. Welcome, Mareike.
Great, thanks for having me, thank you.
And Helena Larrauri is co-founder and director of Build Up, a non-profit organization that works to identify and apply innovative practices to prevent conflict and tackle polarization. She has extensive experience advising and supporting UN agencies, multilateral organizations, and NGOs working in conflict and fragile contexts. And she specializes in the integration of digital technology and innovation processes to peace processes. And she's going to be talking particularly on those kind of themes. Thank you for joining us, Helena.
Thank you for having me.
So just to kick off, before we hear from the speakers themselves, we all know that coronavirus is more than just a public health emergency. It has implications for every area of society, and it creates this dualism that we've become used to hearing about: lives and livelihoods, threats to both, but also affecting education, environment, culture, and with the potential to deepen social divisions and inequalities. We're starting to see some of those effects across the globe, but what effects particularly are there in parts of the world which are already fragile, with weak governance systems, and what kinds of risks does the pandemic pose for peace and security, and where and how can we best address these kind of risks? And to explore this, we're going to attempt a sort of multi-level analysis, as well as recognizing that different policy domains contribute to stability and development with security and achieving those. So we can think of peace and also peace building in terms of action clearly at the global level and interventions by international organizations, institutions, as well as global civil society. And we can also view it from the standpoint of national politics and policies, and certainly the national, not to say the nationalist perspective, has perhaps dominated how coronavirus as a health crisis has been handled so far. Will the same perspective apply in addressing the security challenges of the pandemic? And not least, peace and peace building are locally situated phenomena. So how should we see the challenges of COVID-19 for grassroots security, and what kind of novel peace building strategies and practices might be useful to counter the impact of the pandemic in communities? So let me turn over to our speakers. Perhaps Helen, could you start us off with some thoughts looking at international and national policy opportunities of how this pandemic challenges peace and security and what we might do about it?
Well, thanks, and thanks for inviting me to participate in the panel. I start from the assumption that this pandemic is posing very grave risks to peace and security. So I want to outline a little why I think that and what I think might be able to be done. As you've said in introducing us, Mary, the pandemic is an all-encompassing crisis. It begins as a health crisis, it becomes a full-blown economic and social crisis. And in efforts to address it, to stop it spreading, a significant part of the world's population has been subjected to lockdowns. That has had a very serious effect on jobs and on livelihoods. The ILO estimated, I think back in April, that around half the jobs in the informal sector were at risk, and then estimated a decline in the number of hours worked of around 10.5% in the formal economy, which is equivalent to a loss of around 300 million or more full-time jobs. Out of this, we're likely to see a growth in extreme poverty in our world for the very first time this century. And the numbers who would fall back into extreme poverty are varying very widely. The World Bank initially came in with an estimate of 40 to 60 million. Then the UN University published research with contributions, including from King's College London, suggesting it could be upwards of 420 million. That's a huge range, but for sure, more will fall back into extreme poverty. We have had the World Food Programme chief, David Beasley, go to the Security Council to say to them that WFP estimates a famine of near biblical proportions, because the numbers living on the brink of starvation would more or less double from before COVID-19 numbers to the height of the pandemic numbers. Now, at the nation state level, in reaction to this crisis, by late last month, more than 100 countries had applied to the International Monetary Fund for emergency support, which it doesn't have the funding to give. When economies stall during lockdowns, of course, so do revenues for governments, as well as the jobs and the livelihoods. And many governments, without the emergency support that's being requested, will be left unable to service their debts and unable to sustain their spending on the most basic services that people rely on. So having painted that picture, I say put it all together. In other circumstances where you have a sudden and steep rise in extreme poverty, in joblessness, in hunger, in out-of-school children, in decline in basic services, is this not a recipe for turbulence and upheaval? Social cohesion is strained beyond its limits. You can see a collapse in law and order. You can see a very repressive response to that. And I think we're all aware that among a range of authoritarian regimes around the world, they've taken the attitude of don't miss a good crisis to crack down further on people who they considered a pest or a menace or a threat to their perpetuation in power. Now, internal upheavals, uprisings, repression, all of this can have spillover effects that go beyond the nations immediately affected through to the neighbours, through migration, flight, forced displacement. And I think in painting a picture of that, I would say look to the collapse of Venezuela, which was happening pre-COVID, and the examples of what an economic collapse can then precipitate through the broader region with the flight of desperate people seeking something better for themselves and for their families. The whole subcontinent has felt the impact of that. So you would think that the prospects of such a scenario, dire as it is, might globalize global action, but actually hasn't. I make one exception to that. I think it is fantastic that the European Union led on mobilizing resources for a health response, basically around the agenda set out by the Global Pandemic Monitoring Board to mobilize funding for development of diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. A useful $8 billion amount of money. And Gavi also had a very successful funding round, and that will be relevant at the point if and when we get a vaccine. But frankly, 8 billion is the petty cash in terms of what is required here to try to stop states falling over under these severe pressures. And I'll come back to the sum of money that we're talking about in a moment. So who is failing here? Well, number one, the UN Security Council. Think back to Ebola, 2014. The Security Council, September that year, passed a resolution. It declared Ebola a threat to global peace and security, and it called on all member states to do whatever they could to step up to fight that threat. We have had no such resolution from the UN Security Council. Actually, the UN Secretary General could confront this. He could invoke Article 99 of the Charter, which was put there for a purpose and has never been used, but if not now, when? That article enables the Secretary General to bring to the attention of the UN Security Council any matter which, in his opinion, his or her opinion, may threaten international peace and security. Now, the Secretary General, to his credit, has called for a global ceasefire, saying all warring parties stop fighting and focus on fighting the epidemic together, the pandemic together. When the Security Council was called on to pass a resolution supporting his call, it has been unable to do so. It failed at an attempt that got right through to a no objection basis. Somebody objected, and there's many reasons for that we could go into. But frankly, this is pathetic to see missing in action the world's peak global peace and security body in what is undoubtedly the greatest crisis of the lifetimes of most of us. And it, of course, reflects the tremendous polarization between great powers at the moment, which in itself is a threat to global peace and security, exacerbated, I would say, by the war of words between two of them over COVID-19. If anything should spur calls for reform of the global peace and security architecture, it is this. Because these days, the threat to global peace and security, which the Security Council was set up to counter, which was that of another world war. That's not what we're talking about. It has to move with the times and recognize, as it did in 2014, that a pandemic is a threat to global peace and security, and it shouldn't be missing in action. Now, also missing in action is the G20. Cast your minds back to 2009 and the global financial crisis. Full credit to Prime Minister Gordon Brown of the United Kingdom, who rallied the troops, the other leaders at the G20, for the $1 trillion package to stop economies going over the cliff at the height of the GFC. Now, we're not talking $1 trillion now. The IMF says that $2.5 trillion is needed to support emerging market and developing economies through this crisis. So far, it has been able to mobilize nothing like that. Countries need debt waivers. They need fiscal space created, which goes beyond comfort zones. Look, my country's now got a fiscal deficit beyond its comfort zone. So is the UK, so is Spain, so is every developed country. We're bankable. I'm talking about economies that may not be bankable at all. And if the international financial institutions can't play their part, we're in very, very serious trouble. The G20 leaders, representing 85% of the global GDP, are the ones who must mobilize this package. Now, let me come to a conclusion here. The risk is, if the world blunders on like this, we face not only a very deep recession, we face a global depression, we face the prospect of large-scale unrest, met by repression, human rights abuses, forced displacement, everything added up to global peace and security crisis. The one thing I would put on the table at this point where I would urge leadership is, I think, the UNSG, the Director General of the WHO and the heads of the IMF and the World Bank should stand up now and say, we're forming a standing pandemic emergency coordination council, and each of us is going to use our convening power to bring people together for a truly global response to this. The Secretary General speaks to heads of state and government, the WHO to health ministers, and very importantly, the IMF to finance ministers and the World Bank to finance and international development ministers. If you could get all those constituencies mobilized, you've got a chance of a global response. But at the moment, I don't see it. And I think it's cause for very great concern.
Thank you, Helen. And so you see the kind of almost the ground zero coming up as the financial and economic areas of action. That's where we really have to address all the kind of risks that you've outlined.
Yes, I was tempted to say that in this case, for me, the first step in peace and peace building will be very large dollops of cash for the international financial institutions to play their part. And, you go back to April, I worked with Gordon Brown and other leaders on a letter to the G20 setting out an agenda. And then in May, when there wasn't a response, we thought we'll set that again. And we set it out in quite stark terms of what we were seeing, the figures coming in about the projections of what could happen. Still a deep silence, although I think there are obviously elements in the G20 nations who would like to do something, but you're left thinking, I like to be an optimist, but I'm a very worried optimist. I think that if we don't see an expression of global solidarity around stopping the prospect of emerging and developing economies going over the cliff because they simply cannot access finance to keep things going, then we have a worst case scenario. And of course, for the fragile and conflict affected states with weak governments, it's a particularly precarious time. But here I am in the South Pacific. I am aware of a number of the close island neighbors of New Zealand, the Samoas, Fijis, Cook Islands, Niue, Vanuatu, to whom tourism is incredibly important. In the Caribbean, tourism-dependent economies have got to upper middle income status, some to point of graduation, including in the Pacific, their economies are ruined. So it's not just in those we see as traditionally the most fragile that this is hitting very, very hard. It's in those who've done rather well with services economies and face no business.
Thank you. And I think it's really interesting to go back to you mentioned the response to the Ebola crisis, because obviously we're told the whole time we understand this is unprecedented, some of the figures you were quoting on extreme poverty and so on. We've never seen these levels before. And yet, there is, I was always taught there was nothing new under the sun. You always have some lessons that you could draw on. And I think that was one from the Ebola crisis that certainly would have been a good precedent to follow. But let me turn to Mareike Schomerus, because Mareike, I mean, you see things, you see perhaps risks in a particular way. What does the idea of the risk calculus look like from your perspective? And maybe you want to, I don't know, would you take issue also with Helen's point about actually what we need is money at the moment and large dollops of cash? But over to you, tell us your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Mary. I don't take issue with the point that we need money, but I think a crucial point is, where does the money go? How is it received and what happens? And I guess that's where my starting point is. So we go to a very, very different level, which is very much, how does this experience of COVID is received on the, at the very end of this chain of how this money is dispersed. And I'm really struck by some parallels here, because I think one thing that we've seen for years and years and years is that environments of fragility and conflict are imagined through quite a limited set of imaginations, the kind of the mental models with which we understand what it means to be in a fragile or conflict-infected environment has not changed very much. And I think this is a really important moment, because I see some parallels here between the pandemic and what maybe the pandemic could invite us to do. So in history, pandemics have completely changed frameworks of interpretation. So we know that, we only have public health because we had the bubonic plagues. We only have vaccinations because we have smallpox. It has completely changed how people understood a condition. It's, pandemics are often called the transitory moment from the Middle Ages to modernity, because it was a moment when the nature of disease was completely understood in different ways. It moved from thinking, well, you can understand disease by reading ancient texts or only by observing a patient or by balancing the fluids in the body, to understanding that there could be an outside factor such as bacteria or a virus. And I kind of want to invite us to say, well, actually, could this also be a moment to change our understanding of what conflict and fragility means, to develop a really new framework of how we understand this, and to take seriously what previous frameworks like the human security framework and so on have invited us to do already, which is to say, how are these dynamics, these events experienced at the very local, at the grassroots, whatever word you want to choose, level, or I would go as far as to say as to the individual level. And I'm going to make 3 points, which I base on kind of 2 sets of research, which I can elaborate on them empirically a bit later during the conversation if we have time. But at the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium, we've conducted research on populations in conflict-affected areas in 8 countries over the past 10 years. And we looked at their livelihood shocks, what happened to people coming out of conflict, how did they recover, what the experiences were, what were the challenges, how did they relate to their governments. And then we're conducting at the Busara Center, alongside many COVID-related projects, some research on the kind of impact of social distancing policies on economics and emotions in places, as Helen said, where social distancing isn't really possible. So I want to give like 2 points that I think could be this possible new framework of understanding conflict and fragility. And this is important also because in many ways, we often still talk about conflict and fragile contexts as if they're development challenges, but just a little bit worse. And I think we see from our research time and again that actually they have a specific quality that is very different, and that also makes it much, much harder to come out of a situation, to recover from conflict. And I would argue this is a really important insight for the current situation. So there's 3 points that I want to make. The first one is that both COVID and conflict are often imagined as this kind of almost an equalizing, overpowering experience. We often look at both COVID and conflict as if everyone has essentially the same experience of this, or by extension, that the impact that people feel will primarily come from either conflict or, we now think, COVID. And what's really interesting in our research, and it was very surprising to find this after so many years of working in countries affected by conflict, that actually often conflict is not the most important shock that happens to people. And I think it was a surprising finding. We often get challenged on it, but I think it's a very good reminder right now, which links to points made already, that not everyone, first of all, will be affected by COVID in the same way. We know that that's medically possible, but actually also socially, from a social science perspective, that's also true. Not everyone will experience this pandemic in the same way. And actually, for many people, the trickle-down effect of some of the points that Helen made might come through the pandemic, but actually for many people in many people's lives, the pandemic might not be the biggest shock they experience. That is one of the qualities of a fragile environment. You can't pinpoint it to one particular cause in a way. Which takes me to my second point. Both COVID and in many ways also violent conflict are often kind of imagined as these almost standalone, non-changeable issues. We talk about conflict all the time as having to identify the root cause. And once that root cause is clearly identified, it can kind of be addressed and then eradicated. And the imagination is kind of almost medical in the sense that that's how we imagine the virus, right? Once the virus is overcome, then all of these issues that we now see emergence are gone. And of course, what we know about conflict as well is there isn't such a thing as one root cause. On the contrary, root causes change all the time. And the reason why they are somewhat invisible to us is because we can't take that changeability into account enough. And in many ways, we don't take seriously enough that the reason why what people perceive to be the root cause changes is rooted in emotions, rooted in people's perceptions, is how people experience the around them, which of course, perceptions change all the time. Again, one of the interesting findings that we had from the SLRC was that even in places where the conflict situation had abated and where life has clearly become better, even in those situations, people's perception of life getting better wasn't improving. So actually there's kind of a specific quality to the fragile environment that makes it very, very difficult to experience it as getting better. This is important because perceptions link to what you think is possible, and it links to hope, it links to expectations. And we see that in some of the research with the Busara Center that we've conducted in Kibera, which is the largest informal settlement in Africa, in Nairobi. And in Kibera, we see, first of all, quite shocking expectations of physical violence. So people are clearly in the mindset that this is going to be bad. This is linked to a complete lack of optimism. So people really don't have much hope. Half the people we ask have no hope or very little hope that there's an improvement in the next months. So all of a sudden you're creating this spiral of horrible expectations, a mindset that doesn't see a way out. And we know that these can be really damaging dynamics. And the first one is, the third point I want to make is that both conflict and I would argue also COVID are imagined as if they need to be addressed by urgent and time-bound responses, and that these responses will be effective. And this is kind of a pointer towards a lot of projects, peace building, development, etc., which seem to have a clear starting point, and they want to arrive at a clear end point, and they want there to be a measurable effect. And obviously with COVID, this imagination is kind of enhanced because in the medical realm, this is always easier to imagine that you end up with, the vaccine and then it will be over. And once we have this kind of effective response, then things will change. We know for a fact that, of course, this is not how these situations pan out. The effects that Helen has just described will go on for years and maybe decades to come. And nonetheless, there is a repetition of this idea that you can almost kind of projecticize these responses. In many ways, I experience the COVID pandemic as a projecticized response, rather than taking a broad overview of what are long-term relationships that need to be built to establish the kind of trust and collaboration that Helen said at the moment does not exist. What are some of the relationships that need to be changed between international donor governments and fragile countries? What are the power dynamics there that have been recognized as problematic for years? And yet, nonetheless, there's a repetition of the same kind of approach that looks at this projecticized, outcome-driven, measurable results relationship on these issues that we know are so changeable, are so also emotional and so complex that it seems almost incredible that some of these approaches prevail. So those are some of the points that I wanted to make of how we might want to think about this. And yes, I wonder whether a rethinking of this idea that people have very individualized experiences of both conflict and the pandemic. People have very shiftable perceptions of what the causes are for in their lives and how they can act on these, and moving away from this idea that there will be a one kind of projecticized approach that can address this. I wonder if there's a possibility at the moment to shift our understanding of conflict-affected and fragile environments and almost let that be the new modernity that we know pandemics can bring into our frameworks of thinking. How exactly we might do that, I can talk about a bit more later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mareike. Yeah, we should come back because I know you've got some interesting sort of empirical backup for that. It's a big ask, isn't it? This transformation, when historically it seems that things often are quite slow to move, despite the fact that the crisis itself, as you say, is having very rapidly changing effects on people. But I think that idea of you have to somehow factor in personal experiences. It's a difficult thing for national and international policy, which is often so top down, to kind of factor in. It's even a difficult idea sometimes in the social sciences, isn't it? Because we're told that perceptions are kind of fleeting and not reliable, but yet that's an element that needs to be captured. I was also struck by what you were saying about relationships, because you can also see this in a relationship sense. What are the current relationships at different levels, of course, between global, national, and local. But our institutions rely on strong relationships, and maybe they need to be rethought. Let me turn to Helena, because I think, Helena, your starting point might be, in fact, the everyday, and how security can be both compromised for individuals and particularly through the intervention of technology. So I think you might be able to give us that sort of grassroots kind of perspective, but let us know.
Well, I'll try my best. I really appreciate the global framing that Helen provided, and also the way that Mareike linked at the end to the effect of the pandemic on trust. So as you're saying, Mary, I am going to zoom in on one particular aspect of the pandemic's effect on conflict, because at Build Up, we're especially concerned with divisions that emerge as a result of digital technologies. And we're paying attention to two in particular as they're linked to the pandemic. One is the increasing polarization of online conversation. And the second is the growing control exerted through online surveillance. That's not to say that there aren't other risks at the grassroots and that there could be other perspectives, just that this is what I work on and what I know most about. So let me just say a little bit about each of these risks, and then I'm going to touch very briefly on a couple of things that we're doing at Build Up and that could be done to address their effect on trust. So we've been monitoring how online conversations increase divisions and shape identities in ways that fuel conflict. And that's not new. We were doing that before the pandemic, and it's happening everywhere. It's not just a feature of fragile or conflict context. It's something that we can see in Kenya and Myanmar, in Lebanon, in the USA. It's something that is quite prevalent. I think what's new is that the pandemic is providing fuel to further polarize conversations online. Misinformation about the pandemic is rife. There's actually a WHO initiative to try and address this, as well as a number of other initiatives. And also this misinformation is being used to exacerbate existing conflict divisions. There's so many examples that I'm just going to mention three, so you get a sense. So in northern Nigeria, there was an instance of misinformation circulating that was saying that Muslims were not affected by COVID because it was a punishment for non-Muslims. In India, the virus was depicted in a number of media in Muslim clothing. And in Hungary, Viktor Orban was blaming immigrants for the arrival of COVID in the country. I could go on. There are many instances of this. The other thing that's new and that conflates further this issue of polarizing conversations is that so much more of our life has moved online with social distancing in place, more of our conversations are happening online. In fact, companies are reporting a 12 to 15% increase in internet use across a number of different contexts. And much of that time is spent in poorly regulated internet forums, including on social media. In general, we've seen a large uptick in forums that are in the use of forums that are promoting extremist views. So with these two things together, we're expecting a rise in polarization online. We're expecting it to get worse, both because the pandemic is fueling polarization with the spread of misinformation, but also by the sheer volume of conversations that are happening online. So that's one emergent challenge to peace from the pandemic that is related to digital technologies. The other one that we've been watching is the growth of online surveillance. I have to say that I almost have more questions than I have answers about this one. It's something that we're still trying to figure out. There's two aspects that we're looking at quite closely. One is, as you all know, location data is being used as a way of supporting the control of the pandemic. And that's very effective as a way of controlling outbreaks. But there's a question about what happens to the use of location data after the pandemic. There are a number of concerns, and two places where we've been looking into the concerns on this are in Israel and in South Africa, where increased use of location data could actually end up fueling more division. The second one is the conflation of contact tracing and policing. There's some really great research that is happening on trying to separate these two things. So contact tracing is incredibly important for control of the pandemic, but to use that kind of technique in policing is quite problematic when it comes to civil rights. And this is something that police departments in the United States and in the United Kingdom, for example, have started to say. They started to say we're doing contact tracing as it relates to policing matters, not to pandemic matters. So as I say, I have more questions than answers about that aspect. I think what's clear to me is that surveillance is being deployed at a frightening speed and without that much thought for the long term. So what's necessary and proportionate in the short term in order to control the pandemic may not be in the long term. It seems to me that there's a threat to digital rights inherent in the way that online surveillance is being deployed, and that we really need to pay attention to the conflict dynamics that introduces. So even if this seems like it's speculative, if in the end the short-term measures get rolled back, then of course, no problem with all of these things that I've just said. But I think just the fact that there is speculation about what will happen in the long term with online surveillance is an evidence of the growing lack of trust in governments. So I think if I had to bring these two things together and in an attempt to be a bit more global, since that was the framing of the two speakers as well, so to go from the grassroots to something a bit more global, I think digital technologies were already having an effect on how identities are shaped, and there was already a use of surveillance. And these were already expressing and sustaining socioeconomic inequalities across many countries. My feeling is that the pandemic and the additional issues that come with the pandemic are amplifying these inequities. So the externalities that are associated with the pandemic, such as misinformation, and then the associated response, which is the increase in surveillance, are likely to have a long-lasting effect on trust. And of course, trust is critical to the response to the pandemic, and it's critical to the response to conflict. Both require community networks of trust and trust in government. So with that framing and what we're seeing in a lot of the grassroots activities that we support, the question that we're asking ourselves at Build Up is what can be done to rebuild trust? And in our particular realm of expertise, our focus is on rebuilding trust online. So we're basically doing this with two kinds of peace building interventions, which I won't go into in any detail, but just to mention them. The first is that we want to ensure that consultations related to conflict issues don't disappear because they can't be done face-to-face. And that when they are done virtually, they're done in a way that is meaningful. So one example is that we recently adapted a consultation in Burkina Faso that was supposed to be a 2-day face-to-face workshop into a 10-day broad-based national consultation over WhatsApp. And we did that in a way that was very interactive, that allowed for feedback to be provided to participants later, and that I think really rendered it meaningful. The second area, which I think is probably the one where most attention is required, is really to think about how we can intervene directly in online conversations to depolarize them. We had already done some work pre-pandemic in this area at Build Up. We were running a large intervention in the United States where we were intervening in politically polarized conversations on Facebook and Twitter. And we're now seeing a greater need for that kind of work, certainly in the USA, where we'll continue working, but we've also started doing a piece of work in Western Kenya that uses the same kind of methodology. And the methodology is essentially to watch how online conversations are unfolding and how polarization is manifesting, and to train online dialogue facilitators to intervene directly in those conversations and try to shift them. So just some thoughts from the perspective of digital tech and a bit more grassroots. And I hope that was an interesting contribution to the conversation.
Definitely. Thank you very much, Helena. I mean, I think we want to come back to the whole issue of trust and confidence building. But let me just ask you before I do that about what you're saying in terms of, if I understood you, that there needs to be some kind of regulation and or intervention to limit the downside risks of, the risk to human rights from increasing surveillance and digital action. So maybe that should be on the agenda of the UN or the G20 if we ever get them to meet. But my question was, has that train already left the station? Because clearly, however malfunctioning these kind of surveillance and app systems are, and in the UK there's a lot of controversy around it, and I'm sure in other countries, from just an effectiveness point of view, is it now too late to try and row back and intervene or regulate?
I don't think so. A lot of it depends. It's very much a country by country issue because different countries have introduced different measures. But in most places, the measures that so mostly it's, in terms of location data, for example, it's mostly been governments requesting access to certain data from commercial companies or from mobile phone companies, so they have access to location data. And they've done that typically under emergency powers. So I'm thinking, for example, of South Africa, and I think that the same is true of Israel. So I think the question is just to monitor in some way that really is just used for the emergency, and that it gets rolled back afterwards, and that it remains so that it remains at the aggregate, so that there isn't a danger to individual privacy. So I think the train has left the station in the sense that a lot of governments do in fact have access to location data now, but there was a pressing reason why that was needed. And I think the question now is, how do we legislate in the long term to ensure that doesn't creep into the longer term and have an effect on digital rights?
Thank you. Can I come back then to this issue of trust, and maybe ask you, Helen, how do we begin, where do we begin to rebuild trust, given that I think in a lot of countries, a lot of regions, that is being undermined? Maybe you can tell us some other examples. Maybe New Zealand, for example, is actually different on that score, but how important is it, and what do we do to improve it, to restore it?
Yes, I'm very interested in the points that Helen has made, because I think the extent to which New Zealand has had a relatively successful response to COVID-19, the responsibility lies in a sense with the public trusting the advice it was given. The government did, of course, take emergency powers. We have legislation under the Health Act we can invoke, and we did in our lockdowns have the means to enforce it. But that would have caused a riot if people hadn't got the point, hadn't been transparently communicated with, understood the reasons for it, and said, yep, we'll put up with that because we think, this could work if we all pull together. So actually, our relative success in eliminating community transmission was not because we had repressive and enforcement powers and got better at testing and tracing. it was full community cooperation. Now, I mentioned that, you know, a number of repressive societies have taken the opportunity to become more repressive with the tools that the response to the pandemic provides. I think there are small democratic societies like mine that can offer, you know, other models of how to deal with these things. For example, while the New Zealand Parliament stopped sitting in plenary session, it didn't stop its business with committees, and it set up a special epidemic response committee, which was chaired by the leader of the opposition, which met 3 or 4 days a week, summoned witnesses all day. It was all out there. The epidemiologists were debating the response. People were debating whether the health department was right to stop this or that, and what had the police done here. It's all out there. The media is fully engaged. The public's engaged. Every day, the Prime Minister and the Director General of Health would give their 1 p.m. briefing. People are glued to that. So it became a whole kind of national effort, and everyone knew there's nothing to hide here. You know, people were making an honest effort to try and get on top of this thing. So, you know, you can approach a pandemic and what has to be done in a democratic way, which keeps accountabilities and builds trust that, you know, we're all in this together. Sadly, I've seen other responses which have just relied on a crackdown. I saw another news headline come across my screen tonight, just as I was preparing for you, another whistleblower in China detained. I mean, this is not the way to get your public believing that you're working in their interests. If whistleblowers and those who criticize a response are to be put away and to lose their voice. So I think there's very real issues here.
And of course, you know, in conflict-affected countries where you've got fragile and governance deficits anyway, you're already working from a position where there is that sort of disconnect between sort of national policy and how people are actually experience everyday conflict. So the mountain is that much more difficult to climb, I guess.
Yes, and can I perhaps say a word here from the experience I had as UNDP administrator when Ebola so terribly impacted 3 West African countries, which also had a history of fragility, of dictatorship, in 2 cases outright and protracted civil war. And initially, when authorities tried to deal with Ebola, there was no trust from the citizens. This was a very, very significant obstacle to dealing with Ebola, and with the consequence, and there will be many examples, but one was where the people in moon suits came in to take bodies of people who had died with Ebola and bury them. The minute they'd gone, the community went and dug up the corpse because they didn't trust any of this. So what I saw happen there was that the tide was turned actually when communities became engaged in the response. And I visited myself all 3 countries as we were starting to think about how to come out of this after the sort of peak of the epidemic was gone. And I got full briefings. And what I saw the UN agencies do there, working with the governments and communities, was repurpose activities. So if, for example, as UNDP had in Guinea-Conakry, in the capital, you had an initiative which was working to try to get the police to work more as community policing rather than as a sort of heavy-fisted gendarmerie, and to get the public then to come halfway and say, well, yeah, actually we should work with them to keep our communities safe. That was all repurposed around building trust in the Ebola response. If there was work with youth, that was repurposed to make youth, the community mobilizers, to be part of the tracing system in the community. And a lot of people stood very tall with these kinds of experiences of being able to be engaged. That was the turning point. Communities, peer educators, peer mobilization. And I have enormous faith in communities if they're included, are able to be part of the design of what's happening and can help drive the response.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree with that. I think that's a lesson that we could definitely take from Ebola, that kind of bottom-up approach. I think one of the other things struck me looking at the Ebola situation, but also now, and perhaps responding to some of the points that Helena and all of you have been making, are we seeing, should we be more open to new, or let's say different actors? This is not just about conversations between global institutions, public institutions, or governments and people, that we need a kind of systemic approach that allows all voices to be heard, but also, I mean, the kind of work I do also looks at whether there's a role for the private sector in these kind of conversations and rebuilding economies, but also rebuilding trust where there's a deficit of trust between government and people. And certainly, I guess in the case of your work, Helena, you know, you're dealing with large tech companies as well. They've got to be part of that conversation, haven't they?
Yeah, I do think that they need to be part of that conversation. I don't know. I mean, I think they are part of that conversation, right? So there has been a response from large tech companies already, both on the issues of misinformation on their platforms and on the issue, and there's starting to be more of an emphasis on the issue of polarization on the platforms as well. So that's certainly, I think, something that's there. Mary, could I take the chance to react to something that was being said earlier about fragile contexts? Would that be okay?
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because when I look at certainly the places where we're doing work, it strikes me that the United States is very fragile right now. And it's not the kind of place that we normally speak of when we say fragile and conflict affected contexts. And I think the fragility in the US, there was a question that I saw from the audience that asks specifically about how we're thinking about constructively dealing with the impact of the pandemic on people of color. And I think the case of the United States is very interesting because it's at the confluence of that question, the issue of what fragility means and the issue of trust. One of the main issues that is emerging in the United States and is so clear is the lack of trust in government from people of color, because the pandemic has exacerbated structural inequalities and brought them to the fore much more, as well as, of course, all the other events that have been happening. So I just wonder whether there's something here about how do we think about fragility within countries, and not just about fragile countries, as if that was a separate thing. There's an immense amount of fragility within countries, and a lot of that has to do with structural issues around race and gender. And I think that's something that maybe, you know, it related to what Mareike was saying, needs to be reframed as well a little bit as we think about the response to the pandemic.
Yeah, I think it's always good to rethink our categories, isn't it? So we take so blindly. Mareike, I mean, you know, what's your take on the trust point? And also, actually, Helena was referring to a question that's come from Salvia Kasana, who's an LSE visitor from India. And she's making the point about the impact, how we're dealing with the impact on people of color. But she also asked a question, which is maybe for you, about what does a radical shakeup look like? On the one hand, you know, how bold can we be? And the danger perhaps that with the disruption in international law, will we lose all the progress we have made? So I don't know if you want to tackle those points.
Oh yes, I do like a radical shakeup anytime. So thank you for that question. I wanted to come back to the point on trust, because we've grappled with trust in many, many different ways. And it links also to what Helena just referred to as fragility within countries. I guess we think about it slightly differently, which is along which lines is trust negotiated? And I think that will become a really, really crucial perspective. So in the SLRC work, in a way, that the SLRC's raison d'etre once upon a time was that there was the idea that if a government just provided good services, it would increase its legitimacy. It's almost like the notion that if you can just buy legitimacy, and I would say, you know, for argument's sake, that is very similar to trust. And then we found that that wasn't the case. So then, of course, that poses the interesting question, well, then what? Along the lines of what is legitimacy negotiated and trust built? Obviously, some of these are long historical trajectories, but the really interesting finding, and the latest research on that has just come out, and there was a World Bank blog earlier in the year where this was summarized, was that actually it's not such a it's not a straightforward transactional exchange. But what it can be is that there are certain issues within countries, within parts of countries, within communities, along the lines of which legitimacy is negotiated. Certain issues that have salience, for one reason or another, they resonate particularly. And it's along these issues that governments, states, and the citizens co-create their narratives of legitimacy. This is not a static process. Again, this is not a one-off, you either have it or you don't. This is a permanent process of negotiation. And it involves political power shifts, it involves particular triggers and so on. So a really interesting question would be, will the COVID response become one of these salient issues? Or actually, going back to my earlier point that it could also cover up what other salient issues are. Is it more necessary, for example, to take Helena's example, to look at the knock-on effect of online surveillance? These are really important points. The way we understand these, salience is a behavioral concept. What is it that is available to people in making an interpretation of the world around them? So I think it's really, really important that we understand that the way we imagine and we make sense of all these interactions lies in the ways humans experience their surroundings. But the radical shakeup, I think, really speaks to this, because I think it is fair to say that in the international responses, in dealing with fragile contexts, trust and collaboration have not been very high on the agenda. On the contrary, I'm being a little bit broad-brushed here, but I think it is fair to say that actually international engagement in fragile states has been marked with a very top-down approach. It hasn't created what's imagined as country platforms where governments and international actors, and maybe other actors as well, work together to understand what is a locally appropriate response, to also understand that this needs to be permanently looked at. This is, again, not a one-off, and it is very transaction heavy, and it means that you need to adjust. But if anything, I think the current situation has shown how quickly it is actually possible to adjust responses for better or for worse. And it has also shown that unless these genuine exchanges are, these moments of collaboration, coordination, and cooperation are somehow institutionalized in better ways, they will be fleeting, and it will continue to be a problem. And the trickle-down effect for people who are at the very receiving end of fragility and conflict and botched government responses will continue to be dramatic. So I think the radical shakeup kind of needs to lie in I guess, the mental models of the international actors that is still quite top-down, and an approach to trust and collaboration that we don't see very often in these exchanges.
Can I ask perhaps all of you this issue of intervention, because as you've alluded to, Mareike, that's the kind of has been the go-to tool of the global system for dealing with problems in fragile and conflict states. And Helena mentioned it in a different sense, in terms of intervention with tech companies. Helen, perhaps start with you. How do you see intervention, quote unquote, as it were, as a tool going forward? Is this outdated, or at least can it still be multilateral in the current state of the global order?
Increasingly outdated, I think. I think we need to be looking at how we can work with those who have a vision of the future for their country, which would enable, broadly speaking, the global agenda that we have, which has been pretty sidelined at the moment, but it is the Sustainable Development Agenda to be achieved. In every country, everywhere, in every community, you'll find people who want to get on and have a good stab at doing that. And I think empowering civil society, supporting parliamentarians, supporting free media, supporting enlightened officials with ideas, ministers who are reform elements, reform and change has to come from within. It can never succeed from outside. It can't be imposed. People have to develop their own ways and models in their own context. So the thinking laterally, I think that's the way I would approach it. But I think Helena was right to put on the table the issue of what is a fragile state these days, and to raise the fragility of the United States of America. Who would have thought we would be talking about this in 2020? But a crisis does expose all known vulnerabilities and cleavages in a society. And in many ways, the US has never come to terms with its past. It's land grab from Indigenous people. Its history of slavery. Never been an apology for that, to the best of my knowledge, nor for that matter from the United Kingdom or others who were slave trading nations. Now, I come from a country where Europeans also marched in and took a lot of land. And for the last 40 years, we've had long-running truth and reconciliation processes where we do apologize, we do make amends, reparations are paid, restoration of dignity is a key objective of settlements. We work very hard at these things. So there are ways to mediate through, but I see, a number of the world's great and powerful countries with these painful legacies, which have not been effectively addressed. I think, therefore, in the US right now, you have the perfect storm. You have a narcissistic president who revels in division with other countries, division internally, works up his base no matter what the cost to cohesion in the society. Combine that with a botched COVID-19 response, and then with yet another in the long and tragic history of police killings of African Americans, and you have the single spark that lit the prairie fire. And I think, the institutions of the Republic are under huge stress right now. The saving grace, there is a free opposition, there is a free media, there is civil society, but there's a lot to work through.
The question also on that theme, I guess, for Helen and anybody else that wants to comment, if we look at the institutions themselves, multilateral institutions, how can we reinvigorate that kind of multilateral cooperation? I mean, you started out by saying, Helen, that we needed kind of meetings of the G20 or the financial institutions, but it doesn't look like an imminent prospect, does it? Where is the kind of leadership going to come on reinvigorating that multilateral response?
Well, I think that for the G20, it is unfortunate that this year the presidency lies with Saudi Arabia. I think if this year's presidency had been with, say, France or Germany, you would have seen a willingness to rally nations. And I, would still have some hope that the leaders of those two countries who do have good international standing might yet, spearhead a move in G20 to say we can't let economy after economy go over the cliff with all the consequences that entails. But it needs someone to step forward, as Gordon Brown did in 2009, to rally the troops. With respect to the Security Council, it's pretty dire. I mean, the world's best diplomats are at it, but we have President Trump again today, who's used what the Financial Times has described as a racist term in describing the virus. I mean, this is not conducive to getting any understanding of the Security Council. So I'm rather inclined to think that the leaders of the international institutions should actually stand as a quartet, as I suggested, take the initiative, use their convening power across the four of them, come up with a plan. There's no plan at the moment that is covering all the dimensions of the crisis. They have plenty of experts to draw on. I think they now need to articulate from their peak positions what their ask of the international community is, and really stare it down. Say, we need you, G20 leaders, 85% of the global GDP. We need you to back the extra special drawing rights from the international financial institutions. We need you to be underwriting the debt waivers. We need your companies, your banks that are financing to come to the party on this. We need your development assistance to be expanding fiscal space for low and middle income countries. So what we need is leadership. And my appeal would be to the leaders of the multilateral institutions to stand up and be counted and show the way, because the member states are, in a sense, also preoccupied with their own state of pandemic, that they're not stepping forward to take global leadership.
Mary, could I do a pincer on what Helen just said? So she just made this inspiring appeal for multilateral leadership, which I fully agree with. And I do think that there's a dearth of leadership right now, or at least of international leadership at the national level. But because I'm so close to the ground and to civil society organizations, I wonder whether the other pincer is that there really needs to be a stepping up of civil society focusing on this issue of rebuilding trust. Of rebuilding trust in democratic institutions, of rebuilding trust in each other. And there's such an opportunity for that, because there has been such an incredible number of community responses to the pandemic, right? So I spoke about the threats and the risks, but there's also been such an incredible response. And I think that that would be actually very supportive of the kind of international leadership that Helen just spoke about, and perhaps the necessary complement to it.
And maybe if I can add something to that as well, I would agree. And I would also want to add to Helen's plea, and yes, the country's pleading, please, can we have a voice in this? Because that is what we haven't seen, right? We don't see this coordination in genuine ways. The other thing that we find in our work, which we call the mental landscape of post-conflict lives, which kind of tries to capture what is it that makes coming out of a crisis, coming out of fragility really hard. What is it about this specific quality that I mentioned? And one thing that is a very strong finding, and that will probably not surprise any of you, is that broken promises have very, very long histories. So the continued cycle that you can see on, sometimes very high level global interventions, sometimes very localized NGO programs that come in, that promise a particular payoff at some point if people get involved. The continuous cycle of this at the end creates a legacy of broken promises. That means that every next time people withdraw a little bit more. And this links in a very interesting way to risks, because any kind of coming out of a crisis, any kind of development going forward requires some sort of risk taking. It requires some sort of belief that you think there is a better future and I can do something today to achieve that better future. And one of our striking behavioral findings is that people who come out of conflict seem to delay decision makings much into the future. So they repeatedly say, well, there's nothing I will do today, but maybe later I can do it. Of course, once you have 1 year, 2 years, one generation saying, maybe I'll send my kids to school next year, you have a really dramatic knock-on effect. And again, we find this is a specific quality to environments that have come out of conflict, that this idea of simply not taking the risk to get involved with yet another NGO program, yet another entrepreneurship support that promises financial security, and simply to sit and wait is actually kind of a very rationalized way of approaching these really unstable, fragile situations. But of course, the long-term knock-on effect is really dramatic. And I think we can actually extrapolate this to other levels of what happens, right? And why every next cycle will be so much more difficult. And again, if not now, then when? It's really important to break that cycle and to make some of these promises of genuine collaboration real.
Yeah. Mareike, who or where do you think legitimacy resides at the moment in some of these responses to COVID? Sorry, that's a very kind of sweeping, I'm throwing you a curveball as well, but is there, I think Helena, or you made the point that a lot is going on in communities, and we've seen that before. Again, going back to Ebola, as Helen said, I think that was a critical factor there, that the communities got mobilized. But where do you see legitimacy sitting at the moment?
That is a really, really tricky question, because in a way, my point yeah, and it sounds like a cop-out answer, but I am a researcher, so research is needed to answer this question is a good answer. But more seriously, I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that the effort needs to be expended to say we need to understand exactly the question that you just asked. What are specific sources of legitimacy? What are, for example, situations where people who have not had trust in their government, but in a current crisis, in an emergent situation, kind of forego this? And maybe some of the kind of surveillance issues that Helena talked about are such situations. But then the knock-on effect of that is unclear. So I don't know whether I have a straightforward answer. I don't have a straightforward answer to say this is the one source of legitimacy. But in a way, if we take my framework the whole way to say this is a situation in which full rethinking is needed, then it is a good moment to say we cannot be guided simply by our emergency understanding of where legitimacy rests, because then the knock-on effects later on will probably be that there is more tension that comes from this, because every single time when these kind of issues are negotiated, political power shifts, right? Interest groups rally. There's a whole lot of movement behind this. Political settlements get rearranged. Some are in, some are out. So to simply take a snapshot of that and say, where is it right now, is really, I think, a dangerous undertaking, because it is in the nature of international responses that snapshots, if they sound good, become the truth for a very, very long time. And that goes against the spirit that you mentioned actually in your opening remarks, which I think is really crucial, to say things need to be adaptive. If we all know we need to keep learning all the time, but the whole point of keeping learning is that you then need to adjust your actions based on this learning. And so I would try to move away from these snapshot moments, but I think they will become crucial. The question of legitimacy and trust in government, I think, will become very acute very quickly if and when a COVID vaccine is found. At the moment, there's kind of this unspoken assumptions that everyone will just be happily vaccinated, save maybe a few groups that have been traditionally against vaccination. But I would argue that we have no way of knowing whether this will be the case, and that actually a knock-on effect of the pandemic response will be very different ways of people's trust in government emerging. And some people might extremely mistrust a vaccination suggestion from a government that hasn't been seen to be taking very good care of them. So I think that's the next scenario in which this will play out.
Thank you. I'm getting a lot of good questions coming in, so I'm going to field a few of them to you. I think Chris Langdon, question to Helena, but all of you, how do you envisage civil society stepping up on rebuilding trust, as you've outlined? How could it happen? Any thoughts?
I think there are so many ways in which it could happen that I'm just going to start with the one I know best. I think there's a lot that civil society can do to tackle misinformation very effectively and to address the polarization of narratives online. And I think that particularly in situations where governments are either overwhelmed with the response or there just isn't a full trust in government, civil society responses that use digital platforms to share accurate and verified information and to intervene in conversations that are becoming polarized can be incredibly impactful. There's actually quite a lot of work happening already in these settings, and including in very conflict-affected contexts where governments don't have the ability to reach communities that most need information about the pandemic, which has been a huge issue. But civil society networks have a much greater reach and much greater trust in many situations. So I think that's something that definitely civil society could do. And I'd also speak to this point of, external interventions or international interventions are just not, it's not going to be enough. It's not going to be sufficient. And it's also, a lot of international interventions are still based on a model of international development that we know is slowly going away. And so I think that kind of supporting and providing resources with grassroots interventions to spread information is one place where we could start.
Mary, just perhaps a practical suggestion here. I've become increasingly interested in a number of the sort of parallel multilateral gatherings, if you like, which see government and civil society and sometimes private sector come together. One I chair is the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative Board, and that has civil society, governments and industry sitting at the table. And it is about transparency and openness and citizens not being robbed of their birthright by corruption in the extractive sector and so on. But in the particular way you framed this question, let me also put on my hat as a global ambassador for the Open Government Partnership, which does have 75 member countries of all kinds of layers of income. And to go into that partnership, you have to have a government that is prepared to say, yes, we recognize civil society as a full partner, and we will have a national action plan, and we will work together on that, on what are the issues we are identifying as critical to having transparency, open government, full citizen engagement, and so on. So I think that for the Open Government Partnership, it might be also time, and I'm sure they are thinking along these lines, of what do we take from the COVID experience? What did it tell us about the need for, working relationships, interaction between civil society and the state? That I just make that as a practical suggestion, because around 40% of the UN's member states are signed up to Open Government Partnership.
Mm. Thank you. We've also had a question which I would put to you, Helen, a different sort of coming at this from a different angle. We talked about civil society, but Laura Puig, if I pronounced that right, Laura, who's an LSE alum, what do you think the role of business should be as we move through and past this pandemic? So with your EITI hat on, Helen, do you think there's also a constructive role that the private sector can play, not least in this kind of trust conundrum and rebuilding confidence?
Oh, definitely, and in at many levels actually. But let's start with, for example, those food processing companies which have kept going without particular protection for their workforces. Again, I've seen another news item flash over the screen tonight. Yet another large factory where workers have been falling like ninepins to COVID-19. These are tragic stories. This is not responsible employment practice to expose workers to that. We need our essential industries going. If there's one thing that had to operate through the crisis, it was the food industry. But to expose the workers to such risk is reprehensible. So, physician, heal thyself with respect to the business community. If you want a voice, walk the talk. But look, on the other hand, many in the private sector have been tremendously helpful as well. The innovation of the private sector in, supporting us to find more new ways to carry on our business in times like this. I mean, how many people had ever had a Zoom conference before this happened? The explosion of ways of connecting in that world that Helena is very familiar with, the technology world. Obviously, there'll be a private sector role in bringing a vaccine if we can develop one to market. But then I think the plea from many, including me, having put my name to the People's Vaccine Call, is for Big Pharma not to try to rip off the world's governments and taxpayers by selling this thing at a high profit. We need now companies and researchers motivated by the ethos of Dr. Salk, who produced the vaccine that enabled us to move towards polio eradication. He said, I don't want to make a cent out of this. I want to help humanity eradicate this disease. So I think business can think on many levels about its business model, how it contributes to innovation, which will help our societies become more inclusive, sustainable, resilient, all of those things. The global compact that the UN operates with business clearly has a role to play. And there will be many who step up, but there are many who are not walking the talk at the moment.
Mareike, perhaps we can triangulate this with you, because there's a question from Aniban. I'm not going to try and pronounce your surname, Aniban, because I will mangle it, but he asks, will the nation state still remain the primary or the sovereign locus of curating the response to global challenges, I suppose, COVID not least? How do you see that? Where does the locus of responsibility also, we haven't talked so much about responsibility, as a concept? How do you see it?
Yeah, interesting, right? Because we talk about these responses in nation states, which are in a way kind of, to many people living in them, quite imaginary. So, we know that for someone who lives in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the notion of a state as someone who provides services and offers protections is pretty vague, if existent at all. So I think what's been really quite jarring and maybe confusing, and again, it speaks to the nature of a fragile environment for many people, is that all of a sudden nation states have become so visible, and all of a sudden governments have national responses, or other governments who are very reluctant to spend before are now spending, depends on where in the world you look. So I think this is already, again, something that needs consideration, that this idea of now working through governments is great if you but it will only work if you understand that many governments do not have reach into their state territories as such. So I guess it takes you back to the question you asked me before, on where legitimacy now rests at the moment. And you mentioned the word responsibility. And I guess in many ways, that's for me a more useful concept. The flip side of responsibility is accountability. So if you have a state where the reach is very, very unclear, it's probably very centralized, the state might be very visible in the capital city, and then it gets increasingly less visible the further away you get. The responsibilities of the state have not been fulfilled there for a long time, if ever. That might not change right now, but what could change right now with a rethinking is this idea of accountability. And again, if we take an example of what might happen with vaccinations and trust in government, there's really interesting examples of something called opportunistic accountability, where a population realized that it was all of a sudden very much in the government's interests that they would do something for the government, and being vaccinated against a different disease was understood to be doing something for the government because it was a request that came from the government. And so they said, okay, we understand you want something from us, but in return, we will do this, but we really need a road. So how about a road building in exchange for us getting vaccinated? And you can see how this might actually become a relationship that is an interesting version of this co-creation that I mentioned before, right? This opportunistic accountability, but then actually that morphs into mutual accountability. And I think this idea of mutual accountability is a really strong framework that could help with imagining and then putting into practice an international response, really exactly who's accountable to whom, and what are the conditions under this accountability, under which this accountability happens, and what role do citizens play in this? What is citizens' engagement needs to look like? How does it need to be supported for these accountability structures to emerge? I completely appreciate that none of these are things that will happen in kind of pandemic emergency response style. I think some of these things will happen in parallel, but it would be really tragic if they didn't happen at all, if we didn't take this moment to say, actually, there are accountability relationships here that kind of transcend this notion of what a government of a kind of nation state needs to be like.
Thank you. I've got there's 2 points in the sort of last few minutes of this. I'm slightly condensing, but one dimension that perhaps we haven't addressed directly, but has come up in a few of the questions, is the kind of regional dimension. And there's a question certainly to you, Mareike, sitting with you not in Nairobi at the moment. You should be in Nairobi, I know. But a question about the impact of COVID on say, African countries, but also an interesting point from Mashinga Sayuba Kombo asking, how do you think countries like Kenya, Zambia, South Africa, how could they have an active voice if we don't want yet another external intervention, as we've already touched on? How can regions, perhaps, and particularly conflict-affected regions, have an active voice?
I guess one thing that I found really fascinating when the pandemic started was that, in a way, it shifted the power balances. Capitalism, in a way, is designed to create winners and losers. That is at the heart of it all. But a pandemic all of a sudden shifted this, because all of a sudden, big, economically powerful countries could not afford to have other countries not come along on a pandemic response, because if the virus is anywhere in the world, it will be everywhere in the world. And so that, I think, again, is an interesting shift. This might sound inappropriate, but maybe this is a genuine moment of solidarity that we haven't seen like this before. And actually on the second question, how can countries like, I think the question is Kenya, Zambia, South Africa, how can they have an active voice in this? I would love to hear Helen's thoughts about this, because she sits in these fora. She probably has a much better sense of what blocks it. What is the obstacle for this active voice? Maybe in the framing that at the moment, this is a situation where truly, in UN language, we cannot afford to leave anyone behind. So what can these countries do to have this active voice?
Helen, any thoughts on that particularly?
Well, firstly, I think the world's regional organizations do have a very important role to play in pandemic response. And Africa has the African Union, but it has the sub-regional organizations too. And I think for SADC, for example, in the Southern African region, East African Community, IGAD, countries in the Horn, ECOWAS, the Central African country grouping again. When you're dealing with COVID and you're dealing with issues of, the borders being a little bit notional in many cases, you need to be thinking regional and cross-border wide. A number of these sub-regions already have quite well developed areas of cooperation, and expanding those so they encompass the cooperation needed for COVID. And then I think, begin to share best practice. In some ways, I've been optimistic about the response which might come from a number of states in Africa on COVID, because there is recent experience of dealing with Ebola in West Africa, Uganda in the past, DRC, of course, has its many complications. But in living memory, many African countries have had to fight infectious disease far more than those in the north have. And there was a very interesting commentary, I think, in the Lancet early on in the pandemic by Sarah Dalglish, who I've worked on health issues. And she wrote, "Who can learn what from whom in response to the pandemic?" And, the astonishing thing to me is how major Western countries, in some cases, fluffed it so badly. Whereas often in East Asia, countries dealt with it more effectively, and getting on the front foot with the public health responses in a number of African states with infectious disease outbreak experience of more recent times has been quite inspiring too. So I think if we're talking knowledge sharing, a lot of the North doesn't have a lot to share with the South in effective responses. It can be the other way around.
Yeah. We're sadly running massively out of time, but I couldn't resist just asking all of you a final question that's come in from Michael Bates for some quick fire responses. What are the opportunities for reform and progress within the international community that we could consider in a post-COVID world order that weren't possible in a pre-COVID world? So if we can end on, if there are positive notes, things we could do going forward that we couldn't do before. Helena, any quick response to that?
Just throwing that one at me at the very end.
Yes.
I think, kind of building off of what Helen just said, I think it's an opportunity to shift power. I think it's so clear that the best responses to the pandemic haven't coincided with what was the traditional leadership in the international community. One of my team members is Syrian, and he, when the pandemic started, we were on a team call, and he said, "Aha, so the whole world is now Syria." And of course he was exaggerating, but what he was referring to was the other side of what Helen is talking about, which is not just that governments in places, in unexpected places maybe have taken leadership, but also civil society. Like a lot of individuals in places that have had fragility for longer are much more used to living with fragility and responding to it and being adaptive. than perhaps civil society in Europe or in the United States. And so I think there's an opportunity to shift power and for voice to come from different places, because there's a lot that can be learned and that can be adapted to different contexts.
Sure. Mareike, you talked at the beginning about it being a transformative moment. So what possibilities are there that maybe didn't exist pre-pandemic?
Well, I think one is the lived experience of what Helena just said, and Helen before this, of people who live in countries that weren't previously considered fragile. All of a sudden, there's a lived experience of what it means when you cannot rely for your government to provide a service. There might not be a respirator for you because services have been underfunded, but it wasn't visible before. So all of a sudden, there's a lived experience of what this feels like. And all of a sudden, I think we can all appreciate maybe much more the need to have hope in a situation, because we all need it at the moment, right? So this, I think, is a genuinely interesting shift in how people might understand how some of these crises fall out. Concrete things that can change, I think, well, first of all, this is a good moment to say, why do responses and intervention continue to look in the same way that they always have done? What are these underpinning mental models? That means that the status quo of development seems to shift much more slowly than the rest of the world. How can we have genuinely networks of trust, of collaboration, of participatory policy processes where it is actually possible for people who have been asked research questions time and time again for years, for decades, to participate in the policy process? What power can be relinquished in a kind of country platform setting that addresses fragility in a completely different way, works with government interests without foregoing that the international community will have their own? Be adaptive, learn, adjust, admit mistakes, but do all of this on a basis of a relationship that is really, this is crucial to happen anyway. And now this is a good moment for this to happen.
And finally, Helen, any last thoughts on, you said you're an optimist. Where are your grounds?
Well, look, I see an opportunity here. This abject failure of the UN Security Council has occurred in the 75th anniversary of the United Nations Charter being agreed. And there is, if it can get any space in this very crowded now international agenda of dealing with a pandemic, there is an opportunity for UN 75 to trigger a re-examination of the global peace and security mechanism. Now, my rough recollection is that back in 2005, when Kofi Annan encouraged a reflection by member states on the future of the UN and big issues like the Security Council and the veto and so on, that there was supposed to be work on proposals which would lead to an extraordinary General Assembly of the United Nations, in a sense, to revisit the 1945 settlement. And I would hope that, the world's best diplomats, and, having been in New York for 8 years, there's some incredible diplomats out there always looking for a way forward, that a way might be found to convene that extraordinary General Assembly. Because if the architecture limps on like this, will it see a centennial? The League of Nations collapsed when it failed to prevent a world war. If the UN peace and security mechanisms fail now, in the face of the cascading crises that we have, the syndemic, a phrase many use, this is not good. So, wake up call. If there's a new president in the United States, there just may be the timing to be conducive to trying to negotiate some kind of new settlement. So that's where my optimism would lie.
Good. Well, always great to leave on an optimistic note, but obviously I think what we've done today is constructed a large, long to-do list as well at every level. And so just to finish by thanking all of you on the panel for your time, but even more your insights and thoughts in what is obviously a very broad-ranging subject, but I think we got into some really interesting thematics there. I should also say thanks to our tech team who make all this possible, and nothing collapsed. Thank you in the audience for all your questions. I hope we got to a fair few of them, and I think you can see in the kind of chat box or the Q&A thing, if you want to see more events of this kind, not least Helen, who is appearing again on Friday, I think, at an LSE event, so check that one out. There's some incredibly diverse and interesting conversations going on, and we always want you to be part of that. So thank you to all, and have a good day, good night, good morning, wherever you are, and as they say, stay safe. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.